All right.
Which is what they need.
Good evening. Welcome to tonight's work session. Kind of an unusual circumstance in the sense that you're getting a 2-for-1 if you're watching at home. The first part, which we'll begin here in a moment, deals with the reuse of the Doble Reserve Center. It's relatively early in that process, but there are still important steps that have begun and will continue. And then after this ends, we'll immediately go into a different subject. That is the board and commission appointment process. A Blue Ribbon Committee put together at the beginning of last year to talk about how we put boards and commissions together and get new blood in and keep talent together and all that sort of thing. But that's second. Our first one is about the reuse of the Doble Reserve Center, and I will turn it over to our City Manager, John Bohanko, to kick off that discussion.
Thank you, Your Honor. Tonight we will be talking about the Paul Doble Reserve Center, as you all are aware, under the most recent BRAC, the Base Realignment and Closure Act. The Paul Doble Reserve Center is slated for closure. What I'd like to do is I'd like to have the Deputy City Manager, Cindy Hayden, and David Moore, Community Development Program Manager, walk you through the process and how this is all going to more or less play out over the next few months. One thing I would like to say to the City Council tonight, really there's no action that's required. I think the items that are identified that we'll be talking about, it's just the beginning of a process, and that what I'd like to have come out of tonight is just an idea of setting a public hearing, and we can ratify that at Monday's regular meeting. So those are some of the outcome for tonight really is just to set the public hearing, which we're required by law to do. And I'll let Cindy and David walk you through the process and some of the interests that we've heard about the building. One thing that's important right at the outset to short circuit this so people at home know that the building probably won't come available until 2012. So it isn't like something's going to happen tomorrow. It's important to recognize it will be 2012 because all the consolidation needs to be funded as well for other facilities. So 2012 is probably the time frame that we're looking at. So with that, I turn it over to Cindy.
Thank you, John. What we want to do is just give you process schedule for anyone who hasn't been to the property. We just have some slides to show you the lay of the land there, and then at the very end we'll talk about what some of the reuse options are that have come to our attention so far. In terms of the process, under the BRAC process, there has to be a local redevelopment authority, which in this case is the City Council. City Council elected to do that. That's a pretty simple role. The City Council, as redevelopment authority, just has to develop a reuse plan for the property, and the reuse plan does not have to be extensive. This is a very small, simple plan, as are most of the plans for reuse of other BRAC properties, and in fact most of that is appendices. So it's a very simple plan. As John said, it's going to be almost 2012 at the earliest before the Reserve Center vacates their operations there, and so that's almost 5 years down the road. There are certain requirements under BRAC law. One of the key ones is that you have to do outreach to homeless service providers and other agencies to see if they have a use for the property. That does not mean that the ultimate plan for reuse for the property has to have a homelessness component. It just means you have to balance homeless needs with other needs of the community. And another requirement, as John said, is the holding of a public hearing. We hope to propose that as April 4th, and that's where the council would hold a public hearing to find out what the community wants to do with that property. And then finally, the submission of the reuse plan. And again, that's a very brief reuse plan. So just to go over the schedule, right now, over the next few months, we'll be developing the reuse plan. We hope to have a public hearing on April 4th, if that is the council's desire. By June 20th of this year, that's a key date, we have to submit our reuse plan to the federal government. And first of all, HUD will approve the reuse plan, and that's because of the homelessness component. They do that in September, and then the Army has a period of time for their approval process for the plan. With that, I'm going to turn it over to David Moore.
I'm just going to provide some information about the property itself. The Doble Reserve Center is located at 125 Cottage Street. Cottage Street is runs on the screen here. You have the Portsmouth traffic circle and the Route 1 bypass extending north and south here. Cottage Street runs from the bypass to Woodbury Avenue near its terminus at Bartlett Street, so the very end of Woodbury Avenue. The parcel itself is located right here in this kind of shape. It's that's 125. As you can see if you have your handout in front of you, attached to the memo, you'll see the building itself is located right in this section of the parcel, and an outbuilding, which is known as a maintenance garage, is out there as well, where the Army, the 94th Regional Readiness Command, uses it as a maintenance facility for its vehicles. Very light maintenance, we're told, has been done out there. The building itself is a one-story. It consists mainly of office spaces as well as an assembly space. That'll be more clear as I flip through to one of the floor plans. As for the surrounding uses, this here is a map of the zones surrounding the parcel. You can see it's basically the zones adjacent to the parcel are made up of the general residence A, which includes these sections over here. These are mostly single-family homes. Then there's the general B, general business district here, which includes the Meadowbrook on this side and the Best Western up there. Adjacent to the parcel is this parking lot. So those are the zones. So basically, if you consider the parcel a square, on three sides of that square is the residential, general residential A district. This is a site plan of the building. On this slide, you can really see the building's makeup, and that is the one-story structure here connected to the assembly space. And then, of course, the maintenance garage off to the right there. Here's the floor plan itself. It shows characteristic of the property is this long corridor that runs nearly the length of it and accesses the rooms off to the side. You can see these are classrooms 1, 2, 3, and 4 here. 3 and 4, there's a partition there, so that opens up into an open space. The rest of the rooms are made up of offices, and you might see them referred to in your handout as lockers. You'll see some pictures of these rooms later on, but they're all very, the building is situated for basically an office setting. That's the breakup as it is now. The construction is concrete block with brick facing. There's drop ceilings with fluorescent lighting. This hallway here connects to the assembly, which is makes up 30% of the building's square footage. It is an open assembly room, looks something like a gym. They use it as a drill hall, as I understand it. The unit there does. The square footage total of the building is 14,000 square feet, and so the assembly is roughly about 4,000 square feet. The parcel itself is 3.4 acres. Some pictures, these are some of the elevations. The staff have had the opportunity to tour the building back in August with a representative from the Army, and we're all familiar with the exterior of the building for the most part. These are some examples of the classrooms and office spaces you'd find inside the building. You can see the concrete blocks, you can see some tiles, you can see the dated furniture, dated but functional furniture, and you can see the locker space up here. So when they refer to lockers on that floor plan, it's really a cage-like portion of a room. This is some pictures of the assembly area. Again, picture a large open space, non-partitioned. There's a high ceiling, concrete floor. They even have some basketball hoops in there. There's a kitchen, a commercial kitchen, which is adjacent to the assembly. There's some of the commercial equipment that is in there. And here's the maintenance garage, 2-bay, heated, concrete floor again. That's that long hallway that accesses most of the rooms and the restrooms, all of which are in very good shape.
And the last thing that we want to talk to you about before your discussion is just some of the options for reuse that we have been discussed internally out there. And the first two are homeless proposals. Remember, I mentioned at the very beginning we had to do outreach to the community, particularly homeless service providers, as to what they might have for needs for this facility under BRAC law.
Cindy, just wanted to just make sure to clarify, all these pretty much are proposals that have come into us as required. We advertised this, so we didn't go out and seek these. What we did is we allowed the process to work. The only thing we did do is on the municipal uses. That's the only one that we solicited departments. I just wanted to make that clear.
Right. And so under the BRAC law, the first two homeless proposals, Crossroad House submitted a proposal with possible interest of having their transitional housing facility and their homeless shelter relocated down to this site. The second one was a collaborative effort of the Housing Partnership, the YMCA, United Way, and Crossroads as well, and that would be for 25 units of housing, 6 of which would be for the transitional housing from Crossroads House. The Housing Partnership would construct and manage the project. United Way would do advocacy while the project was under development, and the role of the Y would be for daycare there. So that was the second proposal received. After this outreach effort that we were required to do closed, we also did receive a letter from the Disabled American Veterans who have offices right now in Newington, and their letter just expressed interest in possible use of this facility for relocating their offices. And in terms of municipal reuse, we looked at our own operations to try and get a handle on whether there were any departments who had an interest for a good match for this facility. And the police department has expressed some interest, and I imagine we can get into that a little bit in the discussion portion here. The other reuse option that we discussed internally was for nonprofit office space. As you know, we lease out the Cybolt building to nonprofits, and there was some discussion of the possibility of relocating some of those Cybolt agencies to the Doble facility, thereby freeing up the Cybolt building for other potential municipal uses. And then the last one, housing reuse. We've talked about a range of affordable housing or workforce housing, possibly in combination with market rate housing. And very recently, the Portsmouth Housing Authority indicates they have some interest in this site as well for some type of housing project, and I believe they're going to be discussing that further in the near future with their board. That concludes our presentation of the various options discussed to date, and this is the sort of discussion you would have when you have your public hearing, as presumably others would come forward with possibly additional ideas or thoughts on these that we've laid out so far.
So, Your Honor, what I think probably might be the first item would probably be to talk about the police department's interest, and quite frankly, this was as a result of discussions because the building is not going to be, or the land is not going to be available till 2012. There is a thought that maybe we should start looking just to do some long-term planning for our facilities, and the one facility that may need to have additional room and standalone, many police departments are going to standalone operations would be the police department. And Captain Irving is here, and he might want to summarize some of that.
Good evening. I think basically what we're looking at is the issues we're having here in the building. As you know, we have a couple items in for capital for expansion, and we learned of this, and we just wanted to keep that as an open option for us down the road to see if this might be something that would be suitable for the police department. You know, again, it's hard to predict what will happen in 2012, but it's something we wanted to keep our options open. And you know, if there was a possibility of funding to look into a police department use of that facility, we would certainly be in favor or look forward to.
Again, that is a 5 to 6 year horizon. The other thing that's important that we looked at is, as Cindy mentioned, option number 5, administrative space for nonprofit organizations. It may be something we want to do is to take those nonprofit operations out of the Sidebolt building, move them over to the Dobles or whatever would become that facility, and then have that space next door available for other uses, such as, it might be the school department at some point might want to or need to find the space for their administrative offices, or these are all the things we're trying to kind of put in the mix to see if, from a planning perspective, they make any sense. So certainly, if any of these are very preliminary. They're just part of a brainstorming, if you will, to try to get some initial thoughts. And from a city operational perspective, we thought it was important to at least put those in the mix. The two obvious ones were maybe having the police department look at relocating, thus freeing up more space at this location, or having the administrative offices for the Sidebolt relocating, thus freeing up more space here. So there's just a number of things that we're looking at, trying to be proactive.
Well, at this point, I guess it'd be a good opportunity for some discussion and with some Q&A. Councilor Brasso.
Yes, thank you. Are we talking about keeping the buildings that are there, or are we talking about taking those buildings down, or whatever the tenant wants?
I think, Councilor, it's wide open now. I think, in 5 years, I don't know what those buildings will be like. I don't know what, I think Steve Parkinson went through them, and Steve, maybe you can give a little summary of how you feel about those buildings. And
I think as they currently exist in their current use, they're in good condition. Some of the components of the infrastructure of the building, such as the heating system and related equipment to that, is somewhat new, but is dated, shall we say. I know they did do quite a bit of work in the late 90s on that entire system. But as far as structurally what they'll be in 5 years, I'm not sure how, if they know that they're going to be vacating, how much investment they're going to put into the facilities during, say, a 5-year period.
so it could be a combination, Councilor. It could either, at some point, hypothetically, you could take that building down and you could use the 3+ acres to put up some kind of housing, or take that building down and design a state-of-the-art police department. The one thing about the police department issue is we'll know better in the next 4 or 3 years about what's going to happen with the whole traffic circle issue, the Route 1 bypass. So again, it's very preliminary. I hesitate to have said this tonight because I don't want the people to think that we're going out and building a police station tomorrow. It's 5 or 6 years and may never leave this facility, but.
Just to
Sure.
follow up, I'd like everyone to keep in mind that there is a general residence area there, and that is a neighborhood.
Right.
Portsmouth is slowly losing its neighborhoods, and I really, whatever goes in there, I think should be compatible, and keep that in mind.
Sure, I think that's why for the public hearing that you schedule, you'll probably get that input from the residents.
Very good. Councilor Whitehouse.
John, when the federal government declares a piece of property non-usable or surplus, does the state have first refusal? And it goes right down state,
I'll let
county?
Cindy answer that. I think I know the answer, but I'll let Cindy answer it.
The state didn't weigh in. They could have early in the process said, we have an interest in that property, and they have not expressed any interest.
I'm just afraid, as you mentioned, John, the circle redevelopment and the state looking at that piece of property for an ideal spot for a highway.
I think they're too late now.
I hope so.
They are.
I hope so. And like Joan said, it's in a neighborhood area, and for a highway department to be stationed there
Right.
would be detrimental.
They would have had to get in the queue
Yeah. Hope so.
early.
Good question. Councilor Smith.
Thank you, Your Honor. Just a couple of questions on according to what has been outlaid to us tonight, we would have to get a reuse plan to Department of Army and HUD for June 20th, 2007.
Right.
If we did that and we came up with some ideas, how tied are we to those reuse plans? If something changes a couple of years from now, can we go back, pull those plans back and start again if something different comes up? Or once we make the decision, we really have to kind of stay down that particular path?
Good question, and we had that question too, and David Moore looked into that, so I think he's the best person to answer.
We've been told that no matter if a plan is proposed to have a change, that it will need to go through the approval process again. So, for example, you may need to open up the solicitation process again to make sure that you've satisfied the balancing of the homeless needs. So HUD would want to see that if you're going to change your application, they're going to make sure you meet those standards. That's one approval that you'd have to make sure that you got again, received again. And then there's the Department of the Army. Based on the reuse plan that we put forth in June, they're going to conduct their NIPA analysis, which is National Environmental Policy Act analysis, and they are going to do that with the reuse plan in mind. So they're going to be thinking about what the intensity of this use is going to be in their environmental analysis. And so they are going to have to redo that analysis if the use changes, or at least revisit that. And the indication from the Army is that they will do that. They will likely do that, but they have not committed either way. That's actually for these small reserve sites in towns of this size all over this country. That is one of the issues they've had to grapple with at the federal level, and it hasn't completely washed out yet. So I wish I could have a better answer for you, but I think the easiest thing to say is that we'd have to meet the approval criteria again if we were to amend the plan.
So the worst thing that could happen is we just go through the steps again that we went through early on.
Is it possible to put more than one plan down there to say, we know it's going to be either plan A, B, or C, and kind of lead them with three or different ideas?
That's a good question. The Army has a lot of pressure to transfer these. In fact, it's in law. The BRAC law states they must transfer these properties by 2011. And they want to begin that process as soon as possible. So there's no option to do an A, B, or C scenario in the reuse plan from their perspective.
While we're looking at these, and I don't know if the city attorney can answer this one better, sometimes when we get properties from federal government or from the state or something, there's usually issues tied to it. If we do take this property on, are there leases, or stipulations that stuck to it that if we just, for instance, put the police department in there and then years down the road we decide to move the police department over again, does it have to revert back to the federal government, or do we have to start this process again, or where does it go from there?
The federal government has options in terms of how they might convey the property, and every one of them does carry with it strings, if you will, that go forward. And a typical deed from the federal government to a property is about 30 pages of stuff in there. So I guess the answer to your question is yes, there will be strings going forward.
Your Honor, one of the things I think, in following up on Councilor Smith's question, we do have an area on housing reuse and also getting to what Councilor Grasso was saying, and that can be a number of things. That could be moderate and the use of workforce housing, standalone units, multifamily units that would be similar to what we're looking at up at Atlantic Heights. Maybe you can get into a little bit more of that, Cindy or David, because I think that one might have the most flexibility for the city and would also get at keeping it residential. And I'm not suggesting that you have a high density at a location, but something that fits into the neighborhood. I did a project on a base closure in Connecticut that were, about a dozen single family homes where the community maintained the ownership of the land, and that the homes themselves were were basically moderate income, and so it worked out very well. So there's some things you could look at in that regard, but Cindy, maybe?
Yeah, and if
For that.
this, as you know, you recently enacted the residential density incentive ordinance, and if this were to be rezoned to the GRA zone, then that residential density overlay would apply here. And the planning department has done some rough calculations on this, and David can certainly add to it if I miss anything, but basically you could put in 30 units there, and again, that's just, a ballpark. We haven't done any site assessment relative to that. And with the way that property transfers from the federal government to the city, there are a number of ways in which it transfers. If it's a public benefit transfer, similar to what we did at the old U.S. Coast Guard maintenance facility, that was a public benefit transfer, basically free to the city via the National Park Service. They were like the agency that made that happen. If there was an educational use, then it would be through the Federal Department of Education. So it all depends what use the property is going to be put to as to how it comes to the city, whether it's completely free, whether it's a negotiated sale, or whether you actually auctioned it off for private use. So depending upon what mix of affordable housing versus market rate housing, or what mix you had, there might be some price tag associated with it, and there would be appraisals required by the federal government. It would be a negotiated sale. Whereas if you went all towards the, if the Portsmouth Housing Authority were interested in this property, and it was more towards the affordable housing, 80% below of median income, then it would be more likely a straight public benefit transfer and free to the city. So, David Holden, I don't know if you want to add anything in terms of the zoning there and what we've looked at.
I think that's pretty much the complete story. The only one I would add is you could also do a traditional subdivision, and that would give you lesser units, but there are several options available.
And I should also point out that Portsmouth Housing Authority does have units located right next door, immediately adjacent to this property as well. And just by way of clarification, because it always comes up, affordable housing, typically we're talking families earning below 80% of median area income. And workforce housing these days is referred to as people making between 80% and 120% of median area income. And the recently passed residential density incentive ordinance is tied to that 120% of median area income. And basically, in a nutshell, that density incentive ordinance says, figure out under conventional zoning how many units you could have, and you can have a bonus of 50% more.
Right, and the income typically in that regard would be between about $80,000 for a family of four.
It goes up to 120% of the median, and for a family of four, David, is that about right? It's like 77, 79,000.
Yeah, so you're talking about a family of four with an income of almost $80,000.
Correct.
So that's really the options for reuse. I think probably what we'll do, if it's okay, Your Honor, just to...
Actually, again, I saw one more question here.
Sure.
Before we close the loop. Sorry, Counselor.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Actually, earlier I had pretty much the same question as Counselor Smith, and I guess would feel the same way, or would just kind of express it seems like a fairly big decision with a long time frame out for it coming into effect, 5 years. And so I would hope that, I almost would expect that, whatever we decided, we might think that we might go around again, a year or two from now or 3 years from now because of some of the things that have been mentioned, so many things going on, not just in the area with the Route 1 bypass and the traffic circle, but also sort of other moving parts, other moving pieces, public buildings, public land in our city that we're going through right now, building reuse. So I just throw that out.
The one option, the one option I don't think we put out here is that you could just say we have no use. spot.
Well, I don't know if
We
we
could-
want to
we
do
could-
that.
No,
because we-
I think it's important to say that.
I
That's-
think we,
I mean,
it's
I
more
think-
like we have multiple possible uses, and do we have to decide on one in 4 months?
Counsel, I'm just saying that that's not up there, but the city could say, we don't, open it to the private sector and let the chips
Well,
fall
you're-
where they may.
You're totally, that's
That's just an option.
maybe
that I'm
valid,
just-
but it's certainly not, that's the opposite of what I'm saying. I'm saying that.
I wasn't
like-
suggesting that you were, I was trying to not argue what you're saying. I'm just telling you what one of the options is missing up there.
It's a good point. That should be up there as an option, yeah.
I think what you're saying
Because
is,
the
fine with
public
that.
needs to know that, because they might come up and say, let the market bear whatever will go there. We don't want the city involved in it. We want to see the federal government get what it can get for it and put every use in there that is zoned appropriately that way. You could do that.
I'd like to go on and actually throw out another potential use, and preface it by noting a few things. When I first heard that this property was going to come back to the city or available to the city, my first thought was, wow, that's a fairly large parcel, which makes it, pretty precious, sort of precious property in Portsmouth. We're not a city that has a lot of large lots left with which to do significant things. And it's also, although, as has been shown tonight, it is in a residential area, it also is quite near the Route 1 bypass, which is a significant transportation artery. So my thought on a potential use for this property would be to address what I think, and I think that other people think this as well in the city, that to perhaps address something that I don't want to say it's a shortcoming, but we have our challenges in terms of our recreation facilities. My idea is a potential use as a rec center, whereas now we have a downtown Connie Bean, which is everybody regards very cramped, not only in its facilities but in its traffic access. And then we have the Greenleaf Center over there, which came to us in a similar way, but it's sort of out of the way, and a few things that are there. And then specifically, I'll go so far as to suggest that this might be a potential site for something that Portsmouth's never had, which is sort of many people in town and around the seacoast have expressed surprise to me, or wondering why, that Portsmouth doesn't have any kind of an ice rink, a municipal ice rink, or perhaps a commercial ice rink that is available for our use. That there are several smaller cities, towns on the seacoast that have ice rinks. Portsmouth never had one of those. And so, just throwing it out there as an idea, that potential site for an ice rink and perhaps a consolidated rec center, which, if we did something like that, would allow us perhaps to use the Greenleaf Center in a way for one of these other, the land at the,
Well,
So,
I think a couple things.
put it out
We did talk about that internally. We had some discussions about recreation because we knew that was an item that people would probably bring up. And in inventorying what we have for recreation centers for a community of our size, we're not talking about ball fields. No, that's
No.
where we're lacking. We are lacking ball fields, but we
Yeah.
are not lacking in buildings. We have the indoor pool, we have Spinnaker, we have Greenleaf, we have Connie Bean. I don't disagree with you. Consolidation may make sense, but would it make sense at that location? Also, the reuse of Greenleaf, that probably couldn't happen because we developed a plan similar to this for the reuse, and that's that really is an on-demand facility where really there's limited staffing there. It's actually worked out pretty well. The costs have been kept down very well because we have some maintenance costs over there and heating, et cetera. But by and large, people sign up, use a key, et cetera, and it's a self-directed type of environment. To put a rec center over at the location that you're talking about, I think it would be tough. I really do. And we talked about it with the Recreation Department. Probably could find another, if we're going to consolidate, I think we need to look, not just say we're going to consolidate and put it at Doble's because it's available, think what we'd really want to do is if the city council wanted to look at consolidating recreation facilities, you want to take and try to put all the programs together, try to decide best location. So I think it has merit, the consolidation. It's just a matter of, I don't know if that's the location, but heck, we've got till 2012 to really deal with it. But I would hesitate making that our top priority in this particular instance, because staff really didn't come back with that, including the Recreation Department. But it does have merit, the consolidation.
Okay, Councilor Dwyer, just sometimes I wonder if folks, when they're watching and they see a member of the council come in, they go, what, did they not know the meeting? I can assure you, Councilor Dwyer, I believe, came in straight off the plane from back from Washington, professional work, and I believe the plane was delayed at that. So thank you for hightailing it back here. You've gotten the gist of where we were in this process. And I want to give you or anybody else any opportunities to either comment further based on what somebody else has said. I think one thing I would echo from what Councilor Reynolds said is that I think that the upcoming opportunities for discourse, for public hearing, are pretty consequential. Because while it's not impossible to reopen once a decision for a plan has been made, it certainly sounds like it's less than ideal to do it that way too. So it's important, especially I would say for folks that live in the area and that may be most directly affected by whatever happens there, either for or against. Sometimes people only come out when they're against an idea, but also if you're for an idea, one of these proposed or something else, this would be a good opportunity to do it over the next several months. Councilor Grasso.
Could we look at maybe combining more than one thing there? Maybe part of it is housing and then something else too, so that it is, when you look at that land, there's more land there than you think of.
I suppose we could do that. It's all in how we would frame the plan.
Yeah.
I mean, so.
And one last thing I did want to mention, I'm sorry, before forgetting, that Councilor Reynolds had mentioned, and I suspect there are many complications potentially with it, but others at home may hear this and say, wow, let's discuss that for a moment. You'd mentioned the skating rink. Not in this particular one, but I have heard it mentioned before. Oh. So because I don't want anybody saying, well, how come that didn't come up again?
And again, I don't want to be anti-skating rink, but from an operational standpoint, it has its challenges. I mean, you can see what with Dover, the operational end of it. I mean, they're running deficits.
Is it city run? Is it Dover one a municipal?
Yeah, it is set up as at least it was. The idea was to set up as an enterprise fund, self-sustaining. It's had its issues, and that is something that would really be a challenge to break even with.
Mm-hmm. I know those are very expensive to maintain, so that is a challenge with those. Mm-hmm.
Could I respond?
Sure, and then briefly? After that, and then I saw Councilor Dwyer's hand after.
I'm aware of that. I've read specifically about Dover's rink. On the other hand, it's an amenity that this community lacks. We have a high school hockey team, and we send our team, I guess, down to Exeter somewhere. We spend a fair amount doing that, I suppose, both in terms of what we pay and in terms of transporting them. From having been in quite a few rinks in my life, I am pretty confident that the reason that those buildings are such fiscal challenges is that they're usually built on the cheap, and then they are, of course, giant energy hogs, mm-hmm. and they're built, cheaply, and then they eat you alive, and that's what happened with Dover. I mean, any hockey parent knows any ice rink you ever go in, it's like a sheet metal shed, and then they're uncomfortable as anything. And in the summertime, I shudder to think what it takes to keep them running. So, I've always been of the opinion that with better planning and forethought, and perhaps that a city like ours could actually do one that was an asset, and that we could make money by renting ice. It wouldn't have to be something that was a fiscal drain, but perhaps could be an asset for us, because certainly teams in the York County, from here to Hampton, all pay either Dover or Exeter. It's a private outfit, of course, in Exeter that runs their rink. So that was my thought on that.
All right.
Worthy discussion.
Oh, yeah.
Great discussion.
Counselor Dwyer?
With apologies for being late, just a question about public hearing. Would the public hearing be on a single plan that we would put forth, or might it be on multiple ideas?
We would leave it open. We would put forward what you have here tonight. We would put open to the public. In fact, I'm not sure. We would put it on the website. We would say, these are the proposals that we have in at this time, and let people come speak to them. And I think we would want to add the one that said, City of Portsmouth, do nothing, let it go to the private sector. I think that's an option that needs to be addressed up there, because people might come out and say that, or they may not, I don't know. But I think we'd put those up there, let people come in to speak to them, and then we've got May and June to really, April, May, to really look at what we want to do once we hear from the public.
Great. Any other questions or comments? It'll continue in the near future here. I think that's it for this portion of the work session tonight.
And what I will do is, if it's okay, I'll bring it back to formally set the public hearing for April 4th. That's a Wednesday night. That's a regular council meeting, but it's a Wednesday night. But it will be April 4th, and I'll bring it back for Monday night for you to officially set that. Okay?
Great.
And 5-minute recess?
Just a couple minute recess as we're going to go into the term limit related discussion. And thank everybody for being here for this portion this evening.
So basically,
Yeah.
It's
Really, come on.
be nice if it was, we could put ball fields there.
Yeah.
3 acres, you can, 3 acres you could probably put.
When you look at that map and all those general residency,
Not much, right?
I just don't want to lose another neighbor.
Yeah. Huh.
The only thing
They just, we get the businesses.
But I think you need to take that, you need to do it.
This one's saying, it's some nation. Wonder if you could do it more than one.
No.
Okay.
Okay.
You got two big ones.
Welcome back. We're here for the second of two work session topics this evening. This second one, pardon me as I get my paperwork in order, the second one deals with the board and commission appointment process. We put a blue ribbon committee together at the beginning of last year, and I see a few folks here that representing, and it may be, as we're right on time at 7:30, maybe that one or two others come by. But there were a number of topics. I think we'll probably move this to Eric Spear, the chair of the committee. Richard Katz is also here, erstwhile member of the committee as well. Come on down.
Come on
You don't
down.
mind? Come on down.
I will do that.
There you go. That's right. You move those name tags, or else they'll think you're Sherry Garrity, and we got a whole different work session. At any rate, there were a number of topics discussed. A number of them have been implemented or in process. But one in particular dealt with term limits, not uncontroversial in some cases. So we wanted to bring that up tonight and discuss it. So Eric, thanks for coming. Richard, thanks for coming. And sure, please proceed.
Okay. This was all from the original charge of the committee, which was to do two things at the same time: to encourage fresh blood and healthy turnover on the city's boards and commissions, at the same time keeping interested, engaged, and responsible long-term members. So how can we do both of these things? We discussed many different options. We spent a lot of months on this, and we ended up with two recommendations, and these two recommendations kind of work together. The first recommendation, we thought if the city council had more information when it came time to make recommendations for appointments, that they would have a better sense of how long people have been on some of these boards. Right now, it's hard to tell because it just says so-and-so's being reappointed. So what we recommended was that for each appointment, the council would get a list of all the people currently on the board and how many years they've been on the board. And that's important because when you're making an appointment, you're not just saying, well, this person served too long. Really, you want to say, well, how much institutional knowledge is on the whole board? So we wanted to list all the people on the board, even the people who aren't up for reappointment. So that was the first recommendation. With more knowledge, the council as a whole might be in a better position to say, well, we'd like to try somebody new, or this is all very new people, we need to maintain some continuity here. Even with the best intentions, though, sometimes people will end up staying on boards beyond a length of time that's healthy for the city. That in mind, we picked some term limits or year limits, either one, that we figured were on the outside of what would be acceptable. These are limits that we don't really hope that would ever be hit by any person serving on a board. We'd hope that there would be some turnover naturally beforehand, but just in case, we thought these limits would be appropriate. We had different limits for each board based on the input we had into our committee about how much institutional knowledge is important for some of these committees. So that's why it varies, if you were worried about that. And then there's some little bullets in this term limit idea. There would be no term limits for alternates. Presumably, you'd first serve an alternate and then move on in terms of regular capacity, giving you even more years of experience. We also wanted to know that people are welcome to serve on other city boards. I mean, a lot of people want to serve the city, and we don't want to discourage that. And so once you've been on one board for 15 years, we still want you, if you're still interested, please, and we could push you on a different board. And then also they could reapply after sitting out for a term. Maybe if they really want to get back in and the mayor says, that's great, we needed you, we missed you, it was a disaster last 2 years. So, in summation, those are the recommendations we wanted to do. Now, in order to implement the first one, that's easy. The mayor and the city manager work it out. The second one requires, in order to have a lasting impact, the second one requires, in some cases, depending on the board, some ordinance changes. And so what we recommended was that the city spend some time researching this to figure out exactly what needs to be done, because it's not entirely clear. There's state law involved in some cases and city law, stuff like that. So that's the summation of what we're interested in.
Well, like I said, and there were a number of other recommendations made that were perhaps, especially compared to the term limit, were not as maybe difficult to implement or perhaps as consequential, at least on its face. But there were two different, and I think you're right about providing data to council members. The thing is that in some cases, I think on the website, there is already the lion's share of this available. It may just be a matter of taking that next small but important step of making sure that it's in front of the deciders' collective noses. But the term limit portion, I want to open that up. I know I've gotten some correspondence about it from both sides, and I think there are good arguments on both sides of it, and wanted to fire that one around a little bit here, and we'll just open it up that way. And obviously, both Eric and Richard, feel free to, hop right in as we're going around. Let me start with Councilor Dwyer and then go to Councilor Grasso.
Let me start with I have a lot to say about this, but let me start with a question, which is why, and perhaps this is to the city attorney, how did we end up with terms of such different lengths for different boards? Is some in, why does it like that? Because that confuses us.
Some cases, such as the Board of Adjustment, there's actually state law that
Right,
creates the limit.
right. So state law would affect planning and the Board of Adjustment?
Right, planning, Board of Adjustment, HDC.
And those terms are how long? Just by law?
5, right?
Those are all?
Yeah, there are, I don't.
No, the
No, no,
HDC is 3.
HDC is 3.
HDC's 3.
Yeah.
Planning, I think, was 3.
Planning is 3, zoning is 5.
BOA is 5.
Yeah.
BOA.
And planning is,
Board of Adjustment.
Planning is 3.
Yeah.
planning is 3.
Well,
Planning is 3 and
oh.
HDC, I believe is.
So some are state.
So some are state.
Typically, the land use ones are regulated by state law. However, even in those cases, there is some flexibility, I think, for the city council. I mean, the city council adopts the zoning ordinance, for example, and there may be some opportunity for the council to exercise some level of authority. But with regard to the non-land use regulatory boards, for the most part, the city council does have the authority to create whatever kind of terms or whatever kind of term limits it wants. I don't know that there's been any great science that has dictated how these things developed. I think, like so many other things in the government over 300 years of the city of Portsmouth, at different times, different things happen, and when you look at them all later on, maybe they don't seem to mesh.
Right.
Okay. Oh, you want to follow that up? Or?
Well, I'll just put one thing out there,
Yeah.
and I know other people have things to say. I'm going to strongly advocate for, I know this committee has taken a very conservative position in terms of what they recommend, and I think what they've recommended is far too many terms in order to encourage turnover and new blood. I know that we have to work on the other side of it, and Councilor Whitehouse has put forth some ideas that if we don't work on the other side of recruitment and, active engagement of I'm going to say more people than only the mayor really getting people to serve the terms, it won't work. But I think when you look at what we've got there and what we're proposing, this is far too conservative for a city that needs to engage more citizens in its work. And I know a lot of other things go along with that, including whether or not we can open up some of our committees to people who may not be residents, have a stake in Portsmouth, own property in Portsmouth, own a business in Portsmouth. That's another topic, because I know we can't just say we want more turnover and not do some other things. That's enough.
No? We'll keep that going. Councilor Grasso.
Yes, thank you. I think it's a good summation. I noticed the library board is not here, and they automatically,
They have
3
term
years.
limits already.
Yes.
So that's
And you
why
would
they're not
keep
listed.
that in
Right,
place?
right.
Okay, but that should be added, I think,
Okay.
to the
And
chart.
that's 2 terms, correct?
Right.
2 terms,
For-
right.
No.
I have a question. Did your committee think of this, should alternates automatically move up to a full-time position?
Oh, no, we didn't. That's still at the discretion of the mayor, and we hadn't.
Okay.
We just, usually that happens, or sometimes if they don't like it or we don't like them, they don't fit.
Professionally, not personally,
if they
right?
don't
That's
fit,
right.
then that's kind of a trial period for both parties, but.
I think maybe in this, when this whole thing comes together, there should be something clear stated, that the alternate would automatically be considered, or the alternate's name would go in for consideration with others. I think typically alternates have gone right into.
The one case where the city council is required to consider alternates is the zoning.
Okay. And the others that
It's not.
doesn't matter.
So to clarify, when you say to consider, meaning,
That's the exact words in the ordinance.
It's
Consider.
interesting.
would you interpret that to mean to take up for a vote?
I would not, but I think it requires that the name at least be brought forward and discussed.
Okay, yeah. I would say, just to clarify though, right now, it is true, though the tradition has been to, moving on up kind of thing, that it's, with this one exception, not required. From being in the chair for a year and change now, I would say that while it's not universal, generally speaking, there are some advantages to having been an alternate for some period of time that unless there was a rather dynamic candidate coming from out of nowhere, so to speak, that's a pretty good advantage to have as you're looking at a group of candidates, is that if somebody's been sitting on the board as an alternate for, say, a year or two, or in some cases several years, that's an asset as well. So it would tend to be that it works in their favor for very legitimate reasons, but that's not because it has to, it's just that's sort of the way it works. They end up developing an asset in the evaluation process. But perhaps there are ways to articulate that even more clearly, just to make sure that the expectations are set that while this is, while it may increase the chances, if you take advantage of the opportunity to really hone your skills and your knowledge base, it is not a guarantee. Just wanted to look at it. I saw a few hands. I saw Councilor Reynolds and then Councilor Whitehouse.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I was privileged to be a part of this committee and participate under the very, I'd like to just say publicly, very able and judicious management of Mr. Spear. He really kept the process moving. It was a hard one to do for some reason. I guess we didn't exactly have regular meeting times, so even the scheduling of the meetings was a challenge. And to be honest, I was not able to make perhaps even the majority, but that's what I say. I was privileged to at least be able to participate sometimes. But there were very good discussions there and a great mix of people who participated. So I think this is very valuable. As far as what's being recommended, I've never been a real fan of, I mean, in general, I tend not to like anything arbitrary, which I put in that category, sort of coming up with a fixed number of years, like a term limit. So I'm not, and although I think in deference to that, well, if you have to put a limit, make it a high number. I think that's accurate. Councilor Dwyer said that they, in going for term limits, they sort of, the consensus was to lean toward, well, if we're going to have term limits, let's make it a really high number. But I am very much appreciative and strongly in favor of certainly recommendation 1. And I think that recommendation 1, the providing data, and not even just to council members, but I think that this might as well be a part of the information that's just a regular part of any listing of the commission, whether it's posted on the website or anytime it's printed out or asked, because I think that's really kind of gets at what we're getting when we think about this issue. the goal of having a sort of the right balance of new perspective, fresh blood, if you will, and historical perspective, continuity, consistency. And as I know, since I've been on the council, that's the part of the board and commission process that I've always sort of wanted more. When we get proposals and then we vote on confirmations to the committee, that we have lacked the context of, how long has this member been on in relation to the whole committee. And so I'm really enthusiastic about the recommendation that we start to track. Once we, there'll be a little curve getting up, but once we start to do it, it won't be a big deal at all. It'll just be a regular part of the data, and that we keep it on the listing of how long people have been on, and then I think that that's really important information, that as each opportunity to either reappoint a new member or perhaps bring someone new on board, that you have the context of looking and seeing, okay, well, what's this board look like? And for example, I even advocated a sort of a mathematical thing, which didn't get that much support, I guess, but it was sort of considering each appointment or reappointment in the context of sort of the average tenure that was on the board. So I just did the math here on the example rec board, and I see, the average tenure is 10.5 years. Of course, in this one, it's kind of skewed because there are a handful of members who have 21, 20, 15, 17, and then there are a few that have just a few. So average doesn't always tell you what you need to know, but I think really that's the very, very valuable part of this, is just having the data, and then, term limits or some other aspect we can have more discussion about.
Okay. Councilor Whitehouse.
Yes, from our city attorney, the ones that have a state mandate, in a sense, are all the land regulatory boards, like the Board of Adjustment, Planning Board, the HDC, and the EDC. Are those one? What about the Conservation Commission?
Not the EDC.
Not the EDC. Conservation Commission? No.
No, not the Conservation.
Yeah. Just those three land regulatory boards, yeah. I really appreciate what Eric has done in his committee recommendations. As you know, I do feel that experience is important, but yet, by the same token, this brief sentence in Paul McAkron's letter makes a lot of sense to me. And longer service brings with it the danger of having a board member acquire an ownership outlook rather than a service mentality. Mm-hmm. And that hit me right between the eyes almost. And I think we ought to do something, maybe either an ordinance or supporting what the committee is recommending in recommended number 2, term limits. Yep.
Councilor Dwyer.
Glad to hear you say that, Harold. I come from a lot of nonprofit experience, and it's very common in the nonprofit world to do to regulate it in this way, that you regulate the number of consecutive terms, and then you require people to sit out if you're going to have additional terms, and then you may put a lifetime cap, so that it would be very common to have 2 3-year or 2 4-year terms, followed by sitting out for a year, meaning an opportunity to bring new people in, followed by maybe at most 1 more term, to encourage what we're talking about. I think experience is very important, and I think there are different ways to get experience. I think the alternate approach is an excellent one on our boards that require extensive experience. The alternate route is really a good one. I think training is also a good approach, and orientation to the committees. And I say this about myself as well, serving on this. This is not rocket science. You don't need a PhD in 50 years to serve on these boards. What we want is citizen participation. So I think the danger of the privilege and the ownership is very important, and it's also this sense of exclusion. I do like the idea of encouraging people then to go on to other boards. I think we get real value out of the cross-pollination across our boards, and that in some cases where we've started to have boards meet with each other, we get tremendous value out of that, and some of that value can come from the cross-pollination. I wanted to put one more idea on the table to follow what Councilor Reynolds was saying. I think one of the reasons why it's hard for council members to, why it's hard to get turnover is because we have no opportunity to hear a frank discussion about the person's contribution or participation on the board, because we're doing our business in public, and no one wants to make assumptions or make questions that seem like, you know, they're attacking someone for their service. And so often we're voting really in ignorance, unless you happen to also sit on that board, of whether that person is making a contribution, whether they're participating actively, et cetera. So one of the things I want to suggest is that we, and I'll be interested to hear Bob's comment to this, that if we treated these as personnel appointments, and so that we would have an opportunity to hear the honest feedback about how has that person participated? Are we getting active service from the person, or is it now an automatic pilot and it's a sinecure? And I would suggest to do that, to treat it as a personnel issue, perhaps we would even need to, pay people $25 a year or something like that to make it an option.
I know that what you just said is true. I've seen it myself so many times. There would be at least two different ways that I can think of in which it would be lawful to have the kind of non-public discussion that you are suggesting. The major limitation being that the person being discussed would have the option to ask for the meeting to be public if they want it. And it seems to me if they asked, that might not be a problem.
Mm-hmm.
But even without having to go to the length of paying them, I think you can still do it.
One thing I do want to mention while we're on the topic thing, I get to Councilor Smith, that dealt with the cross-pollination is, I've said it several times publicly, but it remains true after 13 or 14 months in the position. One of the most effective tactics to generating more interest in boards where, when I first became mayor a little over a year ago, there were several, in some cases fairly intensive boards where we struggled to have enough candidates, enough applicants to fill the spots, which is a very frustrating situation. You want to fill it, but you don't want to just fill it to fill it. You want a certain minimum level of quality that makes you feel comfortable about the appointment. Now we don't really have that issue, and I think one of the reasons why, there may be a lot of reasons, one may be dumb luck. I mean, but another I would like to think is I would get applicants for a board that did not have any vacancies. And I think it's something that's really valuable. It doesn't take too much time unless we start getting hundreds of applicants, is if you write a short handwritten note just saying, the planning board is full at the moment and won't have a potential vacancy for X number of months. In the meantime, though, there are these 4 boards, and they all have vacancies either currently or soon. If you're interested in one of these, shoot me an email or give me a quick call. And a lot of times, as a percentage, I was surprised at how high a percentage of the times where you shoot the letter back. And I think the personal nature of the letter is important because it's not some, it's, the form letter indicates that it got processed, and that's an important thing to say too. It didn't get stuck in a black hole. But the next one, it says, actually, here's some fresh idea that you might like. Mm-hmm. A large percentage of the time, I get something back. And what I've come to the conclusion is that folks that want to get involved in these different boards and commissions, it's often less about the specific board or commission and more about the desire to get engaged in the community. And while that's not universally true, I think that's often true. And it means that you get a lot of talent out there from folks that just want to get involved in some way. And if it's a land use board, or it's traffic and safety, or it's EDC, or it's the dog committee, there's a lot of people out there that just want to get involved in some way. So there are ways to fill in those cracks. Even among applicants, they're just mismatched with the opportunities at a given moment. So that cross-pollination is very valuable. People have a lot of these interests. It's just a matter of which one's open at the time. Anyway, I think that's important for whoever sits in this chair and for other counselors to do that. I think you get a lot of bang for relatively little investment in time. Councilor Smith.
Thank you, Your Honor. As someone who sat on a board for 14 years before I decided I had had enough, before someone said to me that it was time for me to go, I have given a lot of thought to term limits, and I have never been a fan of term limits because I think that institutional knowledge is so important. However, in looking what this board is doing, having 15 years on the planning board, I'm in agreement with it because, again, I was at that point where I had known it was time for me to move on to something else. So with this in mind, I'm in favor of it. But I think there's some other things that we should be looking into, and that is when somebody does get on, is there, so that if they are on for a long period of time, is there a removal process? If all of a sudden something happens, and because I have always said someone serves on any of these boards really at the whim of the mayor. When I first got onto the board, I wasn't appointed by the mayor. I was brought on by the city manager, because the city manager used to do the appointments, and then it was confirmed by city council. That changed. That changed about what, 12 years ago?
John? Yeah.
Probably about 14 years ago.
Yeah. So I think I was one of the last ones. I started on with when Cal Canny was still manager, and then proceeded through several other city managers. But so I'm glad to see now that it's now with the city, with the mayor. But I would like to see maybe we've talked about this in the past, a 2-3 person committee of city councilors to be able to help with the appointment process, because right now it's really just the mayor, and when I look at it, yes, I look at how somebody is, what their qualifications are for the position, but I also go, you know what, it's the mayor's appointment, and I'm standing behind the mayor, so I usually so that weighs heavily in my mind whether to appoint somebody or not. But I think we have to look into something of a removal process and how that can be done without being messy. If somebody is on the board and something happens, somebody says something, or they just take it into a different direction, and the mayor and city council say, you know what, we're now in a different direction than you're at, and you ask for a resignation. How does that process happen?
What is the current removal process? Besides, in theory, going, hey, I'm asking you to resign.
There is almost no removal processes in any of these laws. The removal that I think he's talking about, the whim of the mayor, is less a removal and more a decision not to reappoint.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And see, when you have some of these, when someone's on for a long period of time, you're basically stuck with the person.
Well, although let me say, though it's not clean all the time, I stress that, the mayor can not reappoint somebody.
Right, but if somebody's in the middle,
recently.
But if somebody's in the middle of their term.
Oh, midterm. Oh,
midterm.
Yeah,
there's no removal process. So that's one. The other one is to be able to look at somebody's record themselves, if they're showing up to the meetings.
Yeah.
I know we have a rule, or it's a consideration of 3 strikes, you're out. And that's something we don't see. We don't get a quarterly report or something to see how their attendance records are of people. Another one is, although I disagree with Councilor Dwyer on this point, that I really think that they should be residents of the city, and be a resident of the city.
For all boards.
For all boards, and be a resident of the city for at least 2 years. Because it really does, for someone just to move in and say, oh, I want to get on a board, and yes, it's important to get involved with something. When I first moved to Portsmouth, I got involved with Chamber of Commerce, Pro Portsmouth, and different organizations because I wanted to be part of the city, and it wasn't until later that I got involved in boards within the city. And I think that just gives it, I just think it's important to you have some ownership into the city, and I don't mean ownership as you have to own a piece of property, but be a resident of the city. Although it is difficult with some people, and I understand we're in a situation where a business owner or a landowner, they have multiple buildings here in town, or that they really have a big interest in what's going on, and they should have a say, yes, but I really think that our local government is run by our citizens and should remain that way. And then, and I also do like the idea of having somebody, let's say they're on for a couple of years, skip a term, and come back. But I don't think I'd want to see a lifetime cap. Maybe they're on for 2 terms, off for a term, back on for 2 terms, because that institutional knowledge may be needed again later on if we don't have a pool of candidates that someone's interested in coming back on, even though they've met their points, you know, all of their time. I think it would be nice to, why shrink in the pool? There have been times that I have seen, we've had a planning, when I was on the planning board, an opening on the planning board for many, many months, and we just weren't getting candidates, or at least candidates that you'd want to get involved with. When we did the study circles, and I really had stressed to everybody when they were doing the master plan that, you know, you've just put big ownership into the city by helping write this master plan. Now, let's get involved with the boards, start taking ownership in what you've just worked on. And I think that's where we're getting a lot of pool of people, is because that process was so open and so engaging with the public, that we were able to now have this more pool of people who are interested in the boards. But in looking at the list of boards, Kelly, correct me, how many boards do we have in the city?
48, 50. A few.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
43.
43 boards. 43 boards by, you know, let's say 5, 7 on average members. That's a lot of people. Maybe the other thing we need to be looking at is, do we need all of these boards?
Exactly.
Is there a point where some of these boards have really outused their usefulness?
Yeah.
And I think that is something else that we as a city council really need to look at, to say, you know, enough is enough. I know I also sit on the Blue Ribbon Committee for the building reuse. We have a deadline where we know we will be disbanding.
Yeah, I think that's good.
And I think when we appoint Blue Ribbon committees, that an end date should be added to them, or at least to say, if there isn't an end date, then why aren't we reevaluating them to make them a full time? Such as a real good one is the cemetery committee. They're doing incredible work out there. They did come up for the request to become a formal board, and that's something we haven't circled back on to really discuss if they should be a formal board or, you know. So I've said my piece.
Councilor Dwyer.
I think Councilor Smith's last point is really excellent. And I think some of the purposes that we have, that we make committees of, might be better served by becoming a subcommittee for an ad hoc purpose of a standing committee. So that instead of creating yet a separate Blue Ribbon Committee or yet another thing, that we have a fewer number of standing committees and we let them take on different issues that come up, and for a term limited time. That also would allow us to have people try something out who aren't sure that they want to be on a committee. I agree with you. I think the idea of Mayor Marchand giving us a very specific term for Blue Ribbon, for the reuse, has really helped our work. It said, you got to get this done during this period of time. I think probably the same thing was true for this committee that Eric has chaired, and I think that's a good practice. I think a number of our separate committees might well fit under the heading of a standing committee.
You know, you're right. I'm sorry, keep going.
Go ahead. This is a separate question about chairmanship, so go ahead.
The quick remark, and it's definitely one of those things, again, it's a learning process as you're going along. I think it's true whether you're a councilor or you're an incoming mayor or whatever, is one of the things, it's not a big surprise when you think about it, is this very discussion, Councilor Smith, that you brought up, is you look at the list, and you go, holy cow, there's 23,000 people, there's 40 or so board, you know, you do the math, you go, you know, it's like being a state rep in New Hampshire. You either were, are, or will be at some point in your life, probably. Same thing with these committees, with all due respect to my friends up there. Then you start to approach some of the folks on some of the committees, you go, well, when's the last time you had a meeting, really?
Well,
I mean, really. And I go, wait a second, we might need a meeting. And I've been doing this for a long time, and there were a couple times in the past where it was very consequential, and no doubt, I mean, that's why it started probably. At some point, there was a flashpoint, and that flashpoint is long gone. And especially when you're just starting and you're going, okay, there's a lot of things you want to do and accomplish, and you kind of say to yourself, you're really fired up about getting certain priorities accomplished, and all of a sudden, to eliminate a number of them, though I think you are correct, and it's something to look at here in the next, tonight and this year. The amount of, how do I put this? The amount of capital that you end up burning, the amount of energy you end up burning with people that you're also hoping will help you do things with either land use or your budget, and all of a sudden people aren't getting past the point that there's a committee that they won't get. That may not be there forever. I think that when you first get in, it's a difficult thing to do because there's so many things flying at you. But then with a little bit of time, and I think this may actually not be a bad time, mid-term of the 2-year cycle. It's actually not a bad time to reflect and contemplate exactly what both of you just mentioned. There's some that could be enveloped in with some finite nature perhaps put to it and further definition. And there are others that maybe there's a good discussion to be had there in general. So anyway,
and just one more clarification. With the 43 committees that we have, we also have staff members that are doing all those hours, writing those minutes, and keeping all this going.
Coming to the meetings in a lot of cases.
Coming to the meetings. That's a lot of hours taken away that I'm sure Mr. Bahenko can find other uses for them. We're blessed. We have Kelly who just does an amazing job for us. But, there's a lot of meetings. She's here every night like we are, and that's time away from her home. And, she wasn't elected to this. It's her job, but, that's still a lot of hours. Yeah. Same with you, John. Sorry. And
yeah, you too. Yeah.
Maybe, Your Honor, we might want to compile a committee, 2 or 3 councilors to go through that list, and I'd be willing to look through it with an open eye and see if there's something that.
I would as well.
Let me think about that, because there are a number of ways we get it. That's absolutely one of them. Another one may involve something even, just throw this one out, a little less formal even than that. That might allow members of the council to sort of take a look at the list and come forward to get together and say, how about this one? How about that one? I think we might be surprised. I don't know this. I haven't asked. Might be surprised at how many members of the council might have some similar questions about similar entities here out of the 43, and see where that goes. Something to think about for sometime in the near future. But
simply just put it out by counselor and have them circle the ones that they feel aren't interested and send them back to us, and we'll just take a look. We'll put a matrix together and say these.
7 of the 9 said, "What the heck is this one doing?"
You take out a couple of committees, you just add it to the pool of people that can go fill other slots.
All I'm saying is let's not make it too difficult. I think you just give the list, circle.
Yeah, that's it. I think so. And probably
sent it all out to us. We all have an updated list.
Yeah.
And just so that the expectations are set, this will not be reduced to 6, in all likelihood. Yeah. So, but that's not what anybody's asking either. Councilor Whitehouse.
Yeah, I might be out of the ordinary, but I feel most of those committees are very important. I mean, the taxi commission, you don't never hear about it until they make a rate change, and then you hear about it. Or the Pierce Island Committee, you never hear about it until the dog issue comes up. Then you hear about the Pierce Island Committee. Many of these committees are important when certain issues and certain problems arise. So, and they feel important by serving on these committees, and it's an interest out there, and I kind of feel that if you're going to dwindle them down, you're not going to be able to dwindle them down too much.
But is there a point where you can put together, take the Pierce Island Committee, very important group, and the rec board,
and the dog
and we do have joint meetings sometimes,
and just combine them into put all of their needs into one committee.
And let them solve it at the committee level.
Exactly.
We've done that.
But instead of having 15 people or 20 people sitting around trying to solve it, you have one committee of 7 trying to concise and resolve the issues. And I'm not saying that these boards are not important. They are. But there's a point where maybe consolidation, you can really finite the exact, what the issues are, and get down, resolve it, and move on to another topic.
Yeah.
At any rate, I think this is good. It's not where we started the discussion. That's okay. Where we'll, in the near future, get a list. Our city manager's already identified a few that I think are no longer in existence. So we're whittling down before your very eyes.
Your Honor, one more quick point. I also understand that there are some committees that, when they're created, are created for life. I believe, Councilor Grasso, you once spoke of the joint building committees.
That's not true.
It's going to go out of business.
Yes, we have a letter which we signed, and the RSA is quoted. They do go out of business.
Okay. I thought you had said before that they.
Oh, Harold did.
Okay.
I always thought that.
So they do cease. Okay.
And we have a letter
No, it may take
that's
a while
been
in some
signed and will
cases.
be coming to
Yeah,
you.
my question is, I'll ask you afterwards.
Okay.
Councilor Dwyer.
This is another inquiry. I note that some of our committees, the mayor appoints the chair, and in some committees, the chair gets elected. Now, is that historic practice? Is that also an ordinance? Is that something we need to bring some system to?
The most typical case is that the committee selects its own chair. I don't think that it's a legal requirement for the most part, and if the city council wanted to make changes in how the chair was selected, I think certainly in the vast majority of those 43 committees, the city council could issue whatever rule it wished to.
Because that seems to go along with some of these things as well, that, all of these ideas are towards systematizing, streamlining, making it more efficient, and that in doing that, the idea of a mayor-appointed chair or a council-appointed chair seems to be consistent with that thinking. I mean, I haven't thought that through fully, but it's just occurred to me, we've got all these different practices out there.
Your Honor, the one thing that you could do for us in the future, when you do establish a Blue Ribbon Committee, or whatever future mayor does, is that they actually set a date certain that it goes out of business, it sunsets. So, for example, if in the case of the Blue Ribbon Committee on Building Reuse, we know that the business will be done by May, give them a little extra time till September, and that's sunset, so Kelly knows it's sunset and that's it. It goes away, unless the city council takes some kind of action to keep it going. I'd rather see it reconstituted for another 6 months, because what happens, there's a couple on the list that don't really have any business left, but there was never any sunsetting provision within the motion. So when the mayor establishes a Blue Ribbon Committee, probably the best thing is to put a date certain when it's going to expire. And then everybody knows that, and then we, a month before it expires, if there's still work to be done, we go back to the council and ask the council to expand that for 3 months or whatever it is. But then we can just, once we have it right on there, it expires on such a date. And on that date, unless it's a vote of the council, it basically.
I think committees like this one and the JSEC committee, for instance, they have probably a definite lifespan, I think the mayor has appointed the chair on those committees, and I don't know about the building reuse committee.
Yep.
But I think
And there's kind of a deliverable,
yeah,
there's a certain point where you've done what you've been asked to do.
But you need to put a date on it.
But a date is probably wise, too.
We had the committee on arts and culture, which I chaired, and that evolved into Art Speak.
We had a date.
And we had a date, and I think that type of committee, the mayor has, or the council has appointed the chair. And I think other ongoing committees like, the EDC and the HDC and, a lot of these that are here, I think are the ones where they probably elected them.
They set up their bylaws within and do that.
Do they, just as a quick question to get a sense, and keeping in mind that 3 of the 9 members of the council aren't here this evening, so I'd be somewhat reluctant to some parts of this discussion to go too far down the road tonight and say that's it. But in terms of the selection of the chair on the different committees, the blue ribbons, it seems that the mayor selects the chair. It's sort of been it. And if it's not a blue ribbon, I guess it's typically not. I don't know if that's universal, but it seems that way.
In some cases, there are ordinances to describe how the chair is selected.
Except for where there are ordinances requiring as such, is there a feeling as to, in general, if for the homogenization, would you rather it's moving towards an appointment of a chair or a selection within the board of a chair?
If I may, Your Honor, I think it really depends upon the board. You have some boards that have rules and bylaws and that they have to follow. And then you have others that are complete ad hoc. They're advisory only. And so it really, either we make sure that every board has, at least even if it's an ad hoc committee, has some sort of, these are our rules and bylaws to set those up, which is an awful lot of work. Or, it's, if they have a bylaws or it's state mandated, then let the board pick the chairs. If it's not, then just do it as the mayor picks them. And because it could be in some instances, whereas traffic and safety used to be done, Councilor Hines was the chairman, but he would pass over, he'd open the meeting and pass it off to somebody else. And so it can be done multiple ways. But I think if they already have rules and bylaws, they should be able to pick their own chairs. If they're an ad hoc or blue ribbon, then it should be done by the mayor.
Let me go with Richard and then Councilor Dwyer.
On this subject, perhaps some sort of uniformity might be desirable. But I bring this up because it's my understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, that the chair of the planning board is selected by secret ballot, and whereupon the HDC is pretty much by nomination and voice vote. So essentially, what do I see about that? I see that the same thing is involved as far as picking people on boards and commissions. You don't want to make any waves, so it's essentially like stand up for the guy, or you're going to be a pariah, or maybe you're too strong-minded enough not to do that. But perhaps there should be some sort of uniformity.
Just a point of clarification on it. The planning board can do it either way.
Okay.
They just choose to do it that style.
Sure.
HDC could do it.
Yeah, the HDC can do it. It's Australian vote is what they call it. If it's
Okay, so you're saying essentially any member could.
They could request it. They could request it to be an open ballot.
I didn't know that.
And planning board for some reason has always done it as a secret ballot. I don't know why, don't know the reason. I know Ray Will was one that always said, let's do it as an open ballot, and he's never got a second on it.
It's interesting.
I learned something.
So did I. I did not know that. I want to go back to the term limit. I'm sorry, Councilor Dwyer.
I think the uniformity is good, and Councilor Smith raises something I hadn't thought about, that we have our boards that have their clear bylaws and rules. We have our blue ribbon that have a term at charge, a limit. And then we have other committees. And it's perhaps those other committees that, if without being too stringent about it, rather than having them each set up a set of rules, maybe there's a generic set of rules that those other committees can live by that are a simple set of basics, unless they already have them.
Well, if I might, Your Honor, I think that at least personally, I think any committee that's an ad hoc committee should be set up as a blue ribbon committee with an end date. If it is that important, then it should probably be established by ordinance, such as the EDC and others. So then they would write in the ordinance to say they would be required to set, like the EDC has its bylaws, the planning board has its bylaws. But if it's something other than a blue ribbon committee and it's established, I really can't think of any others that are set up other than, well, of course, a joint building committee is by statute. So
everything on the list that's not a blue ribbon committee has bylaws and set up an ordinance?
Well, no, they're either, this list is inclusive of things like representatives of Coast and.
Well, I know that, but what about things like a taxi commission, the dog
Taxi
committee?
commission is by ordinance.
And they have bylaws and procedures?
Yep.
We have an ordinance. We have to
Yeah,
abide
see,
by.
if it's My suggestion is to make it simple, is that it's a blue ribbon committee. If it's not a blue ribbon committee and the council feels it's important enough to have, it probably should be established by ordinance. Typically, like, for example, the Pierce Island Committee started as a blue ribbon committee. They did their work for a couple of years and came to the city council and said, our work is important enough, we think it needs to be a formalized board. And then it became a board through the ordinance process and has terms and numbers, et cetera, that are spelled out in the ordinance. That just makes it easier, because if it's, if there's a date certain for it to end, it makes Kelly's life a lot easier, because, like I said, I've crossed off 3 or 4 of these here that probably technically have, did not have a date certain to go out of business, but for all intents and purposes, they're out of business.
I'm going to bring it back as in trying to draw this to a conclusion fairly soon here. The term limit, which is kind of how we began, and be a good place to end and determine what a course of action might be. I've heard sure.
Well, their recommendation is on the last page.
Yes.
He's recommending that the legal department to research the above boards and commissions and find out the necessary steps to implement term limits.
Well, the one question I want to ask, and I'm glad you brought that up because it focuses it further, is I heard at least two different schools of thought dealing with term limits. First of all, kind of just a show of hands among the members of the council. Is there anybody here who would say, regardless of the length of the term limit, is fundamentally opposed to the concept of a term limit? Nothing wrong, just throwing it out. And again, I don't know what the other 3 would say for sure. So, okay. Nobody out here is like throwing fire against term limits on some level in some way. Even if it's something like, I think Councilor Dwyer mentioned, like a lot of nonprofits might do, a couple terms, take a little time off, maybe you cap it, maybe you don't, but a breather in there, something like that. I mean, you can call that a term limit of sorts too. It's something different from what we're doing right now, with the exception of the library trustees, which has a firm 2 term limit. But then I heard another part. So, okay, that's cleared out. Some saying this is designed to be fairly broad. That is to say, if you've been on the BOA for 20 years and you haven't figured it out by now, probably a pretty good time to, you can either be Michael Jordan and walk out when you're on top, or you could be Willie Mays and get pushed out the door, kind of. And that's, and we'd prefer it be more like Michael Jordan. So at 20 years, that's kind of it. That's very conservative and broad. A few others, I think, said, got to be a little bit tighter than that, so that it's got a little bit more teeth, a little more meaning, perhaps. And I don't know what those numbers would be, but for the most part, they'd be smaller than the numbers that were proposed here. I think they both have a lot of merit, but in terms of, before we take it too much further, is there a consensus? Do folks feel that you should keep it big and broad so as to only make sure the most egregious of examples, the most extreme of examples are included? Or should it be a little bit tighter than that?
Your Honor, I think this is, from my side, I think this is a good way to start. Because we had, we've gone all this time without any definite term limits. And basically, philosophically, I'm opposed to term limits, but in a practical sense, I think that we probably do need to implement them, and I, for one, think this is a good way to start.
So at least start and with a broader number. Okay, Councilor Dwyer, I'll kind of whip around.
I want to make sure we're not talking about these as term limits in the way that you talk about them in the classic political sense. These are a limited number of terms. And I see a real difference in those two.
Yep.
So I know that's what you meant. I just want to make an observation about my generation, because I kind of sit right smack in the baby boom generation. And I want to warn people about all of us who are about to retire and get involved in things, and we'll hold on for dear life to these things. So I think they're too long. I don't think you want all of us who are, 60 looking forward to 15 to 20 years on a commission.
Sounds almost more like a sentence, the way you just framed it.
I think we need to make room for the next generation, or we're going to be in real trouble. And I think there's a demographic thing here which we haven't brought up of, the need to pass some of this stuff on to the next generation. So I think this is a great start, and I would urge us to go a little bit further in it and limit these a little bit more.
Okay, and that's true. We're dealing here with uninterrupted. So I guess in effect, we're saying that it's at least a breather for folks, that after a certain number of terms, there'll be a breather.
But I do go along with Ken's, I think it was Ken that mentioned our 2-year residency requirement before coming on the boards, because in the past, I've seen people who've been here 6 months, and they have been appointed to boards. They haven't really had a feel for the community. And I don't even know if you get it in 2 years, but I think that's a fair way to go. And I'd like to see the mayor in the future, whether it's you or who else, look into that, because I think that, if a person's been here 22 months, well, okay, but but 6 months or 9 months, I think they need to wait.
So, and that may be, I want to close the loop on the length of the terms proposed, but something to keep in the back of your mind is whether you'd want a firm minimum, because there is a requirement for running for office here, right? You got to be a resident for 2 years before you can run for local office. And indeed, that's the case for everything from state rep all the way up to governor, I believe, too. You got to live in the state for a certain length of time. So that's not unusual if we want to do that. I would say also, just like being an alternate before becoming a full member is an asset, is a strong piece of the argument to being the best applicant in the pool. Yeah. So is being a resident for a certain amount of time an asset. It doesn't mean that you're a slam dunk just because of that, but I think that all things being equal, I would probably, if two people had similar resumes or applications, I'd take the person who'd been here for, say, 4 years over the person who'd been here for 4 months. Of course, it's never exactly equal, so other things come in, but that's a tiebreaker in favor of the person that's been around for a little while and knows the community perhaps a little better. Yeah. Anyway, again, focusing back to try to close the loop on the length, broad versus tighter. Ned?
Well, I guess I would tend to agree more with Councilor Dwyer. I think that I'd want to see more of these down in the single digits than the double digits. I think for no other reason. I mean, this community is such a terrific community with such a wealth of talent, both long-term residents and people who move here or who move back. That I don't think there's a need for anybody to be on a board for 14 or 15 years, as if there aren't others out there in the community. We have a very, I guess, to keep going with the sports analogy, we have a very deep bench in this community, and we should draw on that more than we do.
Let me go with each, and then I want to ask Richard and Eric to kind of finish up on that. The two of you, Ken,
Thank
Harold.
There may be a deep bench on here, but there's not a lot of them that are putting up their hand for some ice time, which is very difficult. There's a lot of people that have come up to me over the years and said, it looks like that's such an interesting position. I'd love to learn more. I'd love to get on the planning board. I'd love to be part of it. And then they find out the hours that are involved, and they find out that the true commitment is. And it's amazing how fast they go back and sit down. It's probably better that they find that out now than get into it and say, oh, this isn't for me. As for the actual terms, I think it really, for me, would have to come down to which board it is. There are some boards, such as the planning board and the HGC, that the institutional knowledge is so needed. There are times I was so fortunate with sitting with John Sullivan, and he would bring up something that he remembers when this field was a farm, but in some of the stories that he came up with from that institutional knowledge, of course, a lot of that was because of his residency, not time on the board, was so apropos to what our conversation was, and it was needed. Joanne and I, when we were sitting on the HDC, same thing. She had been on the HDC for many years, and it's that institutional knowledge is truly needed. So as much as I would like to see a particular terms, I think it was something we really have to iron out to be which board. And I'm also in favor of, once we get that, then let's have maybe a one-term breather and then allow to come on again, and that same So let's say if we pick 2 terms, have a breather for a term, and then 2 terms again if they want, and they can continue to do that for as long as they wanted. And I also think that if you do put a term on it, it doesn't, if you do 2 terms in the planning, that does not preclude you from being on another board.
Exactly.
You should be.
It's a good thing.
Yeah, we want that. You know, one of the things we had was Arthur Parrott came off the planning board and now sits on the Board of Adjustment. He carried that institutional knowledge over very well.
Let me go with Harold, just
Well, nothing too important. I just wanted to hear from Eric before we go any further.
Okay.
In our decision on this, how he feels about it.
okay, Eric and Richard.
Sure. First, I want to say what people on this board thought, and then I'll tell you what I thought, because they're not here to speak, so I'll try to sum up what they said. All of these lengths of terms were from input from these people who often, in most cases, had served on these boards, and so they gave a length of term, it was very conservative, to where it would be outrageous that you'd want to serve even longer than these years. And so the idea was we wanted something to get passed, and we didn't want to get a lot of static about it. It was too short for the very reasons you were talking about. So that's how we came up with these varying lengths and the reason for some of them being so long. Now, personally, I would definitely be happy with shorter lengths, but I wouldn't want that to get in the way of passing something. I wonder if it's possible to thread the needle. You know, before Roosevelt, there was no law that said a president had to serve more than 2 terms, but it was customary. And it's possible to do that also in this instance, where there would be an ordinance for these long terms, and yet it could still be customary. I don't know if it's legally can be written that way, but it could be customary for people to turn over after 2 terms. And then if there was some certain situation where we needed to have someone on for more than 2 terms, you'd have the freedom to do that without having to write a special law in that case or whatever. So it's possible to have like a middle ground in this situation.
Sort of backing up what Eric has said, this is a consensus opinion. I thought it was very conservative. I think that having the appearance of being on here for this length of time has all of the disadvantages that we've heard about, the tendency toward ownership, and another offshoot of that is people tend to have the perception that these people are going to be here until they drop over. At one time that was the case. I think the perception's still out there. So if nothing else, if something is codified that says this is how long this particular individual is going to be on this board, it gives potential applicants the impetus to say, well, maybe I'd be interested in that and I won't have to wait 7 years to get on it. That sort of business. And I think that's an important aspect of it.
Get a boat mooring faster than you get onto some of these boards.
I see we're past 8:30. I really did want to try to finish, within about 8:30. Let me, Councilor?
Just a thought about institutional memory, because I do think institutional memory is very important, and I think we need to keep building more institutional memory, which is why that's the other side of turnover. But, again, taking a leaf from the nonprofit world, there are different ways to bring that institutional memory back in, and I'm wondering if we might not think about that on some of our boards and committees, that we might create some emerita positions, or we might create some senior positions where occasionally you ask people who have that long institutional memory, who have been off, to come in on particular issues to share experience and share information, and that you really use them as information providers. I think that's something that we probably don't do. And there might be some ways to do that that kind of respects that tremendous history that's there, but also allows, and we could do that even if we kept longer terms.
That'd be great to have in an orientation for a particular board.
It would be terrific, and that there are people then you can call upon as well who understand what your questions are.
Like a job fair.
That's right.
It's
Well,
sufficient.
Exactly, yes.
to close the loop then, I think, as Councilor Whitehouse said, the suggested next action was that the legal department, namely Bob and others, take a look at some of the above boards and commissions to find out necessary steps to implement term limit. I guess what I interpret, at least from the six of us that are here this evening, the members of the council here this evening, is that we are interested in some sort of limit, but not as in this is lifetime. These are consecutive. I'm trying to keep it a consensus sort of thing, that it should not be the same number for every board, different boards, but I think that's sort of what you were saying here as well. But I am getting the sense that at least in isolated cases, the number is seen by the majority of folks here as larger number than you probably would want to see. Maybe not for all of them, but for some of them anyway. I'm trying to get a consensus. But as to what a next step would be, I guess it would be maybe just to say, to figure out which of these would require relatively little action in order to come up with a term limit, whatever that number would be, and which ones would be much more involved because they're codified in various ways.
And I'd also like to hear from the other three counselors who
Sure, yeah,
get
that's
what
right.
their opinions are.
So we'll make sure that we kind of fire this at them and see what they say, and sometime in the near future, probably once we get that and say, okay, well, here's what the process would be, make sure we get the feedback from the other three counselors, and then proceed from there as to what the exact number will be. That's probably what we'll have a final debate within the 9 of us, and move forward in some way, is what I would anticipate.
Great. Thank you.
But thank you, guys. Thank you, Eric. Yeah.
One possible thing before we leave, I went over this with Eric. One of the requirements we had was to look at the application process.
Yep.
The application form.
Yeah.
I came up with a little addendum to that, which Eric has, and if he could pass them out, you don't have to consider tonight, just look at it. The whole idea is that a lot of the boards and commissions, particularly the land use boards, people come on with an attitude toward the direction the city is taking. Through the appointment process, none of this is indicated, so essentially the people doing the appointing don't really know their overall attitude to this. This is just an outline that can be added to or changed or something. It just gives an indication of the direction these people want to go. It's something to consider.
Thank you.
Yeah, I like that. Yeah, good. We will. And one last thing I'd say about the application process, ending on a lighter note, is I would like to see perhaps that we take away the little note that says, how long do you plan on living here? Because I swear.
Everyone says the same thing.
You're asking people to try to predict how much longer they plan on being alive, and that just seems not entirely appropriate.
Essentially,
So,
yeah.
Yeah.
I always got a chuckle out of that.
No, that's it. As long as I can. We're all in that one together.
I just asked my wife.
That's right, it's up to your spouse. Okay, thanks very much, Councilors, for being here for both. Thank you, Eric and Richard, and everybody. Have a great night.